Here's the part that should bother you. Rome didn't fall to an invasion. There was no siege, no barbarian at the gate, no moment where somebody kicked the door in. The Roman Republic died in a room full of people who voted for it. 500 years of checks and balances, consuls who served 1 year and then went home. Vetoes on everything. An entire system built by people who were genuinely, specifically paranoid about one man getting too much power. And they signed it away, on paper, with a majority. Everyone remembers the daggers. Almost nobody remembers the vote. And the vote is the part that actually killed the Republic. The daggers came after, and they came far too late. So how do you talk 5 centuries of institutional paranoia into handing one guy the keys? Slowly. And it doesn't start with Caesar. It starts with a man named Sulla, about 40 years earlier. In 88 BC, Sulla did something no Roman had ever done. He took an army that was supposed to be fighting foreigners and marched it on Rome itself, his own city. Most of his officers refused and walked away. They understood exactly what he was doing. He did it anyway, took the city and had his political enemies killed. Then he made himself dictator, rewrote the constitution in his own favor, and published lists of citizens who could be legally murdered for their property. Anyone could kill a man on that list and collect a reward. Thousands died so that other people could have their houses. And then, bizarrely, he retired, handed power back, went to the countryside and died in bed. Rome told itself this proved the system worked. It proved the opposite. Sulla had demonstrated in public that if you had loyal soldiers, you could simply take Rome, and that afterwards you would be fine. Everyone who came next had seen it done. That's the thing about the Republic's collapse. By the time Caesar shows up, the rules aren't being broken. They're already gone. He's just the first man ruthless enough to say so out loud. Gaius Julius Caesar was, by the standards of his own class, unremarkable at first. Good family, no money, and debts so enormous that when he left for Spain as governor, his creditors tried to physically stop him leaving the city. That detail matters more than it sounds. Roman politics ran on borrowed money. You spent fortunes you didn't have, buying votes and staging games. Then you got a province, and you squeezed the province until you were solvent again. Caesar was simply better at the squeezing than anyone alive. He spent 8 years conquering Gaul, roughly modern France. Ancient sources put the dead in the hundreds of thousands and the enslaved in the hundreds of thousands more. Modern historians argue about the figures, but nobody argues about the shape of it. It was one of the most destructive campaigns in the ancient world, and it made Caesar the richest man in Rome. It also gave him something more dangerous than money. It gave him an army that had followed him for 8 years, that he had made wealthy, and that had stopped thinking of itself as Rome's. That's the actual mechanism. Not ambition. Everyone was ambitious. The mechanism was soldiers who were loyal to a man instead of a state. And Sulla had already proven what you could do with those. The Senate could see it. That's why they ordered him to give up his command and come home as a private citizen. Which brings us to a small river in northern Italy. The Rubicon wasn't a fortress or a border with an enemy. It was an administrative line, the edge of the province Caesar governed. His authority to command troops existed on one side of it and not the other. Crossing it with an army wasn't an act of war against a foreign power. It was a Roman general pointing his soldiers at Rome. He knew exactly what it meant. The sources have him hesitating on the bank. Then he crossed, in January of 49 BC, and the Republic had about 5 years left. What follows is a civil war fought across the entire Mediterranean. And here is the part people skip. Caesar wins it against the odds repeatedly against better supplied opponents. At Pharsalus in Greece, he beats Pompey, his old ally, his former son-in-law, and the greatest general Rome had, while outnumbered roughly 2-1. Pompey fled to Egypt looking for refuge. Egypt was in the middle of its own succession war, and the boy King Ptolemy's advisors made a calculation. They decided that murdering Pompey would buy them Caesar's goodwill. So when Pompey's boat reached the shore, they killed him as he stepped off it, in front of his wife Cornelia, who was watching from the ship and could do nothing. Then they presented Caesar with Pompey's head, expecting gratitude. The sources say he wept. Whether that was grief or performance, or genuine disgust at the manner of it, we can't know. But he had the killers executed, and he did not thank them. Cato the Younger held out longest. Cato was the Republic's conscience, an inflexible man who had opposed Caesar for decades on principle, and who was widely disliked for being right about things too loudly. When Caesar's victory became certain, Cato killed himself at Utica in North Africa rather than accept a pardon. Because accepting a pardon would mean acknowledging that Caesar had the authority to give one. That's the moment the Republic ends as an idea, 2 years before Caesar dies. The last man who refused to concede that one person could grant or withhold Roman lives had removed himself from the equation. And now we get to the vote. Because here's what actually happened after the wars. And it isn't a coup. Nobody seized anything. The Senate, the institution built specifically to prevent one-man rule, voted Caesar the powers, one after another, over about 4 years. They made him dictator, then dictator for 10 years. Then, in February of 44 BC, dictator for life. They voted him the right to sit in a gilded chair, to wear triumphal dress whenever he liked, to have his statue placed among the ancient kings of Rome, which for Romans was close to blasphemy, because the whole national story was that they'd thrown the kings out and would never have another. They put his face on the coinage while he was alive. No living Roman had ever been on a coin. They swore an oath to protect him personally. Senators individually swearing loyalty to a man rather than to Rome. Some of them meant it. Many of them were terrified. A few, according to the sources, were piling on honors deliberately, making him look more and more like a king, hoping the excess would turn the city against him. It doesn't matter which, the votes passed. 500 years of institutional paranoia dismantled by majority, in public, on the record. By the Ides of March, 44 BC, the daggers weren't a defense of the Republic. They were a reaction to something the Senate itself had already ratified. Roughly 60 men were in on it, led by Cassius, with Marcus Brutus as the respectable face. Brutus mattered because his ancestor had supposedly expelled the last king of Rome 400 years earlier. The symbolism was the whole point. They stabbed him 23 times in a hall next to Pompey's theatre. Only one wound was fatal. In the panic, they cut each other. And then they discovered the flaw in the plan. They had a plan for killing Caesar. They had no plan for Rome. They expected the Senate to rise, the Republic to resume, everyone to thank them. Instead, the Senate fled the building. The people rioted at Caesar's funeral and burned down part of the city. Within 2 years, Rome was governed by 3 men with a written list of citizens to execute. Sulla's prescriptions again, in a worse form. Within 17 years, Caesar's adopted heir was sole ruler with absolute power, and the good manners never to use the word king. The Republic was not killed on the Ides of March. It was already dead. The Ides were the autopsy. Here's the part that should stay with you. Every step was legal, or close enough. The soldiers were legally raised. The commands were legally granted. The dictatorship was legally voted. There was never a single moment where the system was overthrown, because the system was never overthrown. It was used correctly, one vote at a time, until there was nothing left of it. That's how republics actually die. Not to invasion, to a majority that keeps voting for the reasonable-sounding option. Right up until the reasonable-sounding option is one man for life. If you want more great powers talking themselves into disaster, and history has never been short of them, subscribe. There's a new one every week.